Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the 4th annual Symposium on the Digital Person, which is this year on digital identity in the post-pandemic world. I hope you've all had an excellent lunch break. I know I certainly did, but I mean, excellent is probably too exciting. A sufficient lunch break. It was a reasonable request. We've got a range of interesting speakers coming up. Having dealt with our technology strand, we're now going to be discussing digital identity in the humanities, and then subsequent to that, digital identity in economic markets, once we start getting into the later afternoon. Joining us first up and being chair of the Digital Humanities stream will be Professor John Norton, who will be coming in any moment now. He'll be discussing on the topic of tech solutionism versus public trust, lessons from the contact tracing fiasco. Tech solutionism is something that we've heard quite a bit about as a theme over the last little while. People just, thinking they can throw tech at a problem without necessarily thinking about the underlying social realities that the technology is acting upon. So I think this will be a particularly interesting topic. Within the Hat Lab, one of the things that we've been working on has been contact tracing ourselves, actually. So we've been incubating along with our partners in Case Western Reserve University, a application called Sharetrace, which is a tool that uses the Hat personal data account technology to privately store and hold and own your personal data, that data being your location and symptom tracking data. What this enables is a way of giving both centralized computation for data on your potential infection rate and where you've been, but also preserving your privacy. So I think for those of you who are interested in applied work on how to have maximally trustworthy systems that preserve individual autonomy, this could be interesting for you to check out. You can find the Sharetrace project website on sharetrace.org. We'll also be having a forthcoming paper coming out of this quite soon, which I look forward to sending you guys more information about in due time. Now, where is Professor Norton? Presume somewhere around here. Perhaps he's having difficulty with the microphone and camera. Professor Norton, perhaps if there's I don't know if you're having issues there. You'll have to switch your camera on. Excellent. Great.
Okay.
Excellent. Welcome for joining. I could have quite happily flannelled for a while yet, but I thought you perhaps wanted to give much better insights than I could.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll cede the floor, and I look forward to the talk.
Thank you, James. Hello, everybody. My name is John Naughton. I'm a senior research fellow in the new Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy at Cambridge University, and I'm also a newspaper columnist. About this session, what we'd like to do with it is to use the concept of tech solutionism as a lens for thinking about how our societies have dealt with the COVID pandemic. I've got three very able colleagues with me to explore this. And the way we'll work is that each of us will give what will be, I hope, a provocative short presentation, and then we'll have quite a lot of discussion, I hope. Now the question is, what is this tech solutionism? It's an idea which has been most recently articulated by Evgeny Morozov, who's a well-known technology critic. And he defines it as an endemic ideology that recasts complex social phenomena like politics, public health, education, and public enforcement as neatly defined problems with definite computable solutions, or as transparent and self-evident processes that can be easily optimized if only the right algorithms are in place. A few points about that. The first is that, and I think it's really important to think of it as an ideology. And ideology is what determines how you're thinking when you don't know you're thinking. It's what makes you regard some things as unthinkable, while other things are obvious. And in this context, I think that's really important. I'm an engineer by background, and so I can say this, that tech solutionism is almost like a reflex that we engineers have. And it's not necessarily sinister as such. But the problem we have now with the dominance of digital technology in our networked world is that solutionism can be absolutely pathological in its consequences. Because, for example, it can prioritize some things while sidelining others. It ignores questions of politics and values. Technocrats and engineers don't much like politics. And often they don't seem to be that interested in values. And solutionism is fatally attractive to government ministers and to political elites, at least in liberal democracies. And once a politician, especially a powerful one, let us say the Secretary of State for Health in the United Kingdom, once a politician gets infected with technological solutionism, then very strange things start to happen. And a message gets passed down from on high, which those working on the technology feel compelled to pay attention to and to give priority to. And sometimes tech solutionism, in its rush to find and implement elegant solutions to complicated problems, it leads to breaches of conventions, sometimes to breaches of the law, and to infringement of rights, which are not visible to the people building the kit, are writing the software. And sometimes I think there's an element of what I would call willful blindness in this area. And we've seen that in cases, for example, in which AI companies have been working alongside NHS researchers, say, on particular problems, where the inconveniences of privacy regulations and data protection are overlooked. And I think, of course, that problem became pathological in relation to the pandemic and contact tracing apps. Now, the question is, what does the COVID-19 response of the UK government and indeed others look like when you view it through this lens? The first and most obvious point is that when the pandemic struck, it was the formula for dealing with it was not rocket science. In fact, it's a formula that's been certainly known since the Middle Ages, and you could find it in Florence in the Middle Ages during the plague. It's the time-honored formula of locate, diagnose, test, trace, isolate. And the strange thing for us in the UK was that this timeless formula seemed to have only been belatedly discovered by the UK government. And when the penny finally dropped, the test, tracing, contacting formula was implemented, I think, initially incompetently and certainly imperfectly. And it's still not working well. But in its place, there was an outbreak of tech solutionism, which was what we need is an app, and that we'll put a lot of resource into that, and that will do the trick. And that's not to say that the idea of an app wasn't relevant, or that an app couldn't play an important role in a test, trace, and isolate strategy. It could do that, provided that it was technically competent and robust, and provided that it was sufficiently trusted by the population that they would install the app and use it as required. But as John Crowcroft pointed out this morning, solutionism wasn't confined to the UK government, or indeed to governments as a whole, because there were operating in this space two giant solutionists called Google and Apple. And they came to dominate the technical debate about contact tracing. And in doing that, interestingly, they were able to set terms and conditions that governments had no alternative except to accept in the end, which in itself raises an interesting question, not much discussed in tech circles generally, which is, well, if that's the case, if two large companies can actually dictate terms to territorial sovereigns, elected democratic governments, what does that mean about sovereignty for territorial administrations? And of course, that's part of a much bigger and I think more worrying process, which is what we've seen over the last decade, is the gradual ceding by territorial sovereigns like governments and courts of sovereignty to what we might call functional sovereigns, like those very big tech companies. So in the background to all of this, there are some really big questions. But in terms of just kicking it off, I think that's all I'd like to say. What we have to help us with this are three colleagues, Julia Powles, Heleen Janssen, and Orla Lynskey. And what I'd like to do next is to hand over to Julia, who's one of my colleagues on the Big Minderoo Global Project.
Thank you, John. Have you got me?
Yeah.
Super. Well, I'm calling in from this evening from the future in Perth, Western Australia, in Wajak Noongar country. And it's quite interesting. I wanted to pick up a couple of points John said. Particularly, I want to come back about two large companies dictating terms to sovereign states and citizens. And while it's sort of somewhat tangential to the contact tracing theme, pick that up in the context of the Google and Facebook charges at the moment around news in Australia, because it's a very interesting contemporary development. So a bit of context for those who might be seeing us in Australia. We are in Perth, Western Australia, COVID-free, but the rest of the country has now got more cases. But to put it in perspective, it's really tiny in global terms. So we, at the point that Australia introduced a contact tracing app, had less than 7,000 cases and less than 100 deaths. And so I found that a very stark portrayal of tech solutionism, because, you know, that's less than the number of deaths that we have from domestic violence a year. And we wouldn't think to impose a solution like digital contact tracing in that scenario. There was no call for it from the agencies engaged in contact tracing that they needed to augment their human capacity. We also had a very modest testing capacity at the time. So this was late April. I think that testing is logically prior to tracing. That wasn't in place. There weren't the cases. And I think the scenario that's run in parallel to the rest of the world is, despite there not being the cases, there has also been no proof that this app assisted in any way. We now have 27,000 cases and still less than 700 deaths, but no case where contact tracing through the app, which has been downloaded by 6.5 million Australians, I think, so some third of the population, that hasn't actually had any significant effect. So it's an interesting one of a counterexample. We were quite drawn to some of the examples in our region where I think it was a useful corrective on always looking to European US models. There was some advances in Singapore, Taiwan, and the Chinese model, of course. But in Australia, the same language about I think the sort of the tech solutionist response of the app was in play when it really was quite divorced, I think, from any appeal for that technology and any proof of efficacy. And it was really as a sense of security to kickstart the economy again, as they did, and we opened up pretty rapidly after that. We've now had a massive reverse in Victoria, which is the only case. Those 600 extra deaths are coming from Victoria, which is in total lockdown. and the rest of the country, the app continues. The thing that I've been trying to trace is how are the background conditions on that app changing over time? Are there any other uses of that data collection for law enforcement and other purposes? And that connects to something in the sort of provocative spirit. I wanted to just speak to a bit about the kinds of requests we might make from digital technology. And the particular requests that I've been looking at recently are those in the proposed code around when Google and Facebook is supporting news stories on their platforms under the Digital Platforms Inquiry. People may have seen this. It's a major piece of work, really world-leading, under the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And the interesting thing following global news is how much the little battle we're having in Australia, where perhaps our politicians can think about something other than COVID, is a real representation of that, I think, John, that ideology and willful blindness, where to the big companies that are used to setting the terms, in this case, that whatever content passes through platforms like Google and Facebook, it's on the same terms, whether or not it's advertising or news about your family or what we call original news content of a democratic variety. All of that is purely content for the platform, and there's no distinction between it. And what this piece of legislation, now draft legislation, seeks to do is to differentiate news from other content and to support the platforms that are the origin of that news. Because during COVID, we've lost 100 local newspapers, and there's great pushback in the from the news industry about how it should be continuing, how the likes of Google and Facebook should be continuing to nourish the stories that are supported on the platform. And I think the sort of factual piece, which is similar to the scale differential of our country in a COVID time and the rest of the world, is around what proportion of of content on the likes of Google and Facebook is news. And it's a small fraction. It's a small fraction of the commercial return of those companies, but of course a hugely significant one at a societal level. And the striking thing is actually how very sober and modest the requests of the Australian government are in relation to what it requires of Google and Facebook in relation to news content. In particular, it's requiring that when algorithmic changes are made that affect news, that they should be notified to news providers. It's requiring that when news is provided on platforms like Google and Facebook, the news providers know what data is collected on their readers. It's requiring that there's some knowledge and transparency around what the commercial return is on each side of the ledger, whether it's the platform or the news company. But the representation, and this is where it connects to the COVID, the sort of Google and Apple decision for the planet to build a infrastructure that through that duopoly gets to every smartphone on the planet. Google and Facebook have preempted the democratic process here, which is that late last year, there was a push from the Australian government to come up with a voluntary code between the companies and news publishers. They didn't come to the table on a voluntary code, so the government then required a mandatory code. That code is now out in draft legislation as an exposure draft through the normal legislative process. And all that it asks is that platforms will come to the table. They still get to determine what level of disclosure they have on those various things, but it recognises that there's an unevenness of bargaining power between platforms and news organisations. And the last month has seen a real assault on social media platforms and on Google, with direct appeals to citizens that what the Australian government is doing is taking away news entirely from Australian citizens. Most Australians, it's well over 50%, receive their news through Facebook. They've been reading about COVID through Facebook. and this the preemptive strike of Facebook is, if this legislation were to pass, they would completely revoke news in Australia because they don't intend to pay for it at all. And it's just it's a striking move. It's been responded to in, I think, appropriate terms, that this is bullying behaviour, and the Australian government is seeking to respond that it doesn't intend to be bullied by anyone. But I think that the aspect of it that is perhaps that connects this sort of tech solutionist mindset and the particularities of these companies and the huge questions they raise, John, and particularly these two companies, is that it's typical to threaten that there'll be these dire consequences when companies are regulated. There'll be tax consequences, production will end, there'll be layoffs, all these sorts of things. But the consequences of it, when you think about it being, news and the implications for democracy, just become quite unbearable. And I think the dummy spit feels all the more detached from our current time when you think of it in that context. But anyway, I thought it would be useful to raise, because having seen some of the international press, there's been a casting of the Australians as being quite well, in exactly the terms that tech companies would portray them, which is that they're foolish about how the internet works. And I think, to the contrary, reading the draft legislation, it's quite a measured way of asking for the sort of information that is a modicum of transparency in how news is shared. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to conversation.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting set of points that you guys raised there. And I know that I certainly have a lot of questions, and I think others have some questions as well. We've just been having some discussion as to whether or not, John, you might prefer to pause now, sort of, bite off and chew over the questions that have been raised in the last two talks that you guys have presented for 20 minutes now, or to advance with the next two speakers and then have 40 minutes at the end. We just sort of reopen that question whilst you guys were presenting. Do you have any particular preferences on that? You're on mute there.
Makes sense to ask the other two speakers and then have a good deal of time for a discussion at the end.
Okay, fantastic, yeah. Fantastic. All right, well then, in that case, if we could call up Dr. Janssen up to the floor. Great.
Yes, I'm in. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I didn't hear John's talk due to technical issues, but I hope I'm going to do well. We discussed what we are going to talk about today. So thank you so much for inviting me as a speaker. My talk will be about practical experience from the ground. As I got involved as a policymaker and a policy advisor in the first app development in the Netherlands. I will say a few words about facts and the political realities, tech solutionism, public trust. And make one caveat here, so I'm really speaking on personal terms and not on behalf of the government. First, some facts. At the beginning of April of this year, the Minister of Health surprised pretty much everyone in the government and the public at large with the initiative to develop a track and trace COVID-19 app. And it was tasked to the Chief Information Officer of the Ministry of Health to develop it. It had to happen in less than 2 weeks. And the idea was to involve the public from the beginning of the process up until the selection of the best app at the end. And it was presented as an experiment with the public engaged. And everyone was invited to develop an app. And after 1 week, Deloitte drew up a long list of promising models. Well, the most promising ones were going to be tested in the second week. And they were tested by internal IT experts and external scientists, IT experts, and privacy experts. Well, finally, 7 apps were selected for the public contest, but none of them were appropriate, useful, or ripe. It was concluded at the end. And also the Data Supervisory Authority gave his very critical opinion on the whole process, we have to say. Now, zooming out from this happening, it's interesting to see how this app would have had to fit in a broader political and societal context. And my take is this, that, well, the Minister of Health presented the app as a novel and indispensable solution to tackle the spread of COVID-19. But it was not clear how the app would relate to testing capacity, for instance. Because at the time there was a real and huge shortage of testing capacity, which is still there today. But we are talking now about this particular app development. And we heard many doctors and health professionals couldn't get sufficient protection due to the shortage of high quality masks and clothing. So there were other issues there as well. So how did the app relate to that kind of things? And all the more visible became that in all people's homes where health professionals could not work at all with the right protection, despite notifying the minister, well, how was that going to be solved by the app? So these were real problems. And it turned out actually that the government had ordered the necessary protection too late. And it became clear that for years there had been a policy to downgrade the number of intensive care beds to the minimum, to the absolute minimum possible. Unlike, for instance, Germany, they really had scaled up their intensive care beds at a very high speed. So Dutch patients were then placed to Germany, in German hospitals. So we saw that at societal level, it was not clear how long the lockdown was going to last, with also economic consequences. So the pandemic had created so far societal uncertainty and unrest among health professionals. And well, I think the health minister seemed to be in need of a quick success. That's my take, given that other policy measures fell visibly short at the time and did not lend themselves particularly for a quick fix. So the app was something new. And my observations and take in the tech solutionism here and implications for public trust they're revolving around at least engaging the public in the app development. So is that a way forward towards public trust? Well, it might look trustworthy, sort of, to engage the public in app development. But how can the public know and determine what the best app is? There were only models presented, and they weren't appropriate at the time. So what do you expect after 1 week of development? Well, the public could not know how the pre-selection was done, for instance, of the apps. They did not get detailed information on how the app would function in their everyday lives, how it would solve other problems. And part of the public could not even understand what information was brought to them about the inner workings and the processing of data, for instance, where the data would go and with whom it would be shared, for instance, what security measures were taken, or who could act as a responsible actor if things would go wrong. This all was not on the table at the time. Now, zooming out from this individual citizen perspective, it was not clear with what public values and ideas of trust, privacy, non-discrimination, inclusion by the public at large, did engineers enter the scene. So with what public values in their mind did they start development of the app and the design? And we also saw that Human Rights Commissioner, it kicked in with its broader opinion because much of the discussion revolved around privacy, but of course there's many more issues here to be discussed. And then well, another point is, of course, that the process was presented as an experiment with the public engaged. But this can never, of course, be a replacement for public support, or let alone a replacement for a democratic process. So it was indeed an experiment, but I think it didn't work out well. And there were lessons learned too. But yeah, another issue I think here is that the government involved also some commercial parties at crucial stages. For instance, the developers were not told with what specific purpose the app had to be developed. So the responsible health institution did not formulate a well-specified legitimate purpose. And it was not clear for the app developers what the app should ultimately do or not do. The answer when we asked this was that the specific purpose would be dealt with later, and they were going to ask McKinsey to help with the formulation of that specific purpose. Now, what do we think from a public trust perspective about the involvement of a commercial actor here, advising the ministry over the necessity and purpose for such an app? Well, what if McKinsey itself proposes an app? And the same applies, of course, to the invitation to ask Deloitte to make the long list. What apps were deselected? According to what criteria? This was not clear. Some key takeaways, I think. So I think technology is applied in many societal contexts, but it never ever sits in a vacuum. It's always interacting with norms, values, people, political realities, and societal realities. And these are too important to leave only to engineers or to certain specific experts in our societies. There must always be an interaction and discussion and dialogue. And tech solutions, yeah, it's becoming a reflex response by many politicians to many societal problems. And that is something worrying, I think. So I would say we have to be aware of tech solutionism by government ministers, favoring quick solutions rather than slow, difficult, and perhaps cumbersome processes, which are here the testing capacity, the masks, other materials, the number of IC beds to be expanded. And I think technology can also have a sort of disrupting effect on procedures and on problem definitions. We saw, for instance, the specification, which is of utmost importance, was almost delegated to a consultant company. So this is where you see this sort of disruptive effect, I think. Yeah, and once we also noticed that once the energy is on a tech solution, it is very difficult to properly position the public values and the fundamental rights at stake. We don't say this is the only thing you have to consider, but it's a range of things you have to consider. So this connection between societal relevance and technical relevance must constantly be made and explained. Well, the question must be very clear that whether and how technical solutions are envisaged to help. So not the other way around. And well, we see that tech is also often a commercial solution looking for a problem, and we should be very careful for that. And also that internal procedures within the government containing important checks and balances, they cannot be overstepped because things have to be speeded up. Even in a crisis, the checks and balances and the balance of power should be well maintained and kept up. So I'm looking forward to a discussion as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Heleen, very much.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Janssen. That was really interesting. So it's Professor Lynskey from the LSE is next up. Hopefully just hopping aboard.
we go. Brilliant. Sorry about that. So great. I'm going to follow on from what Heleen and Julia have already said by considering how the legal and regulatory framework have really fared when confronted with this kind of tech solutionism, as John has labelled it. And I'll start maybe from the micro. So looking at the situation in the UK with the rollout of the NHSX app, or lack of rollout of the NHSX app. And then I'll kind of turn to the issues of tech power that Julia has raised. So, you know, in thinking about why the NHS app came undone, I think it very much kind of struggled with some of the same issues that we've heard about in the Netherlands. That is, a lack of public trust and confidence, which came in part from the fact that civil society organisations and the media never really got behind this app. And that, I think, was as a result of genuine human rights concerns that the app was raising. And so human rights and the human rights legal framework was kind of portrayed as the straitjacket that prevented this app from being rolled out, and as an impediment to this innovation. And I guess my starting point would be that is a very partial account of what happened. That in fact, when we look at the human rights framework that is in place, it is a very flexible framework. One of the big paradoxes at the heart of human rights law is that a legal framework that is designed to protect minorities and designed to protect populations against abuses of power often cedes way very easily for reasons of general interest. And so when you look at the legal provisions we're talking about, things like Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, so the right to privacy, you see that you have a general principle, but then derogations to that general principle. And in the UK, across Europe, and indeed across most of the world now, you see that these rights in this kind of data-driven context are given expression through a data protection framework. And perhaps a critique of that framework is that, or you know, one certainly significant characteristic of that framework in this context is that it is very flexible. And on the one hand, this can be a benefit because it means that the types of contact tracing apps that we were talking about, whether they were centralized or decentralized or whatever the precise form they took, because of the broad scope of application of data protection rules, apps were likely to fall within their remit. And you might contrast that, for instance, to the legal framework in the US, where you have very specific legislation that applies to health data, but it only applies to healthcare providers. And therefore, the processing of data through an app by a private enterprise might not be covered by that very specific sector-specific legislation. So in some ways here, the flexibility of the framework was in itself a benefit because it brought all of this data processing within the remit of the data protection framework. But then what you saw after that was within the framework, there is an awful lot of flexibility which could be taken advantage of by governments when rolling out the app, or by others when rolling out private apps. And so I think first point to note here is that this substantive flexibility in the case of the UK meant that the app could be proposed without having kind of clear constraints in place. And even though the data protection framework provided for core principles, human rights principles like data minimization, where you don't collect unnecessary amounts of data for your purposes, or you don't use data for incompatible purposes, you know, once you collect it for a stated purpose. You can see that those terms of necessity, compatibility are very open textured. And so a first point to note here was that I think in the UK context, in order to confront this kind of technological solution, we would have needed a lot more specification of how those principles would apply in this particular context. And you could see there that there was a bit of a face-off between the government, who said that government assurances would be sufficient, which was obviously not reassuring enough for many people, myself included. Whereas Harriet Harman, the chair of the Joint Human Rights Committee, was saying we need legislation in order to specify and give precision to these principles. And you know, if I take just one example of that, so that notion of necessity, this also shows that even if you have a data protection framework in place, and now we know that there are over 100 data protection frameworks worldwide, it makes a huge difference in practice whether or not that data protection framework is underpinned by human rights considerations or whether it's underpinned by economic considerations. And I think globally we're seeing a bit of a divide here between those who are introducing data protection frameworks in order to facilitate primarily the free flow of data and to liberate its economic value, and those who are introducing data protection frameworks to protect fundamental rights. And even between, I think, human rights courts in Europe, we have a bit of a confrontation as to how a principle like necessity needs to be interpreted, which in the UK, once the end of the transition period is reached, will have, I think, quite significant implications. And the reason I say that is because, ironically, the European Court of Human Rights is now starting to take quite a hands-off approach to human rights adjudication, seen most recently by its failure to accept the Privacy International case against the UK government this morning by declaring it inadmissible. So I think that's one point to note. So it kind of sheds light on some of the advantages and disadvantages of a data protection framework from a substantive perspective. I also think we've seen some of the procedural issues in data protection law and kind of leading beyond data protection to human rights, as Heleen has said, come to light here. Because the role of the Information Commissioner's Office has been put in the spotlight, so the UK's Data Protection Commissioner. And, you know, there's been a recent exchange between 22 MPs briefed by the Open Rights Group and the Information Commissioner about whether or not the stance taken by the Information Commissioner in this instance was robust enough to oversee the rolling out of the contact tracing app and indeed the subsequent test and trace procedures. And if I could just quote for a minute, if you don't mind, from the evidence given by the Information Commissioner to the Joint Human Rights Committee. Now, this was on the eve of the NHS-X app being trialled on the Isle of Wight. So I think that was the 5th of May. This was on the 4th of May. And in describing her role and the role of her office, the Commissioner said, at the front end, in the design of the app, we are a critical friend and we give peer-reviewed technical advice to the NHS-X as we have done. And then she said, Matthew Gould, the head of NHS-X, came to me very early in thinking about the app to make sure there was assurance going forward because all of us expected digital tools to be used. So I think classic example of tech solutionism, but from a regulator, and a regulator tasked with upholding the data protection and privacy rights of a population. And, I think there are two things that are striking about that. So just first of all, the kind of tech solutionism that is inherent in that quote, but secondly, the vision of the role as a critical friend and as an advisor. And if you go to the provisions of the General Data Protection Regulation, the data protection authorities are supposed to be promoting awareness of the data protection rules, but not necessarily giving advice. And here, the only circumstance where advice really would be appropriate is if NHS-X had conducted a data protection impact assessment, as they were supposed to do, and that was a procedural failing on their part, and also a violation of the GDPR. But they were supposed to then engage in a formal prior consultation with the ICO. And as a result, the ICO had the power to respond to that formal prior consultation. That procedure was thrown to the wayside in the development of this app. So we see that there's kind of scant regard really for the letter of the law and how this is supposed to play out procedurally, but also I think on a bigger point and going to the issue of kind of tech power, we have a very distinct vision of a role of a regulator here. And I think if you look at the European Commission's report on kind of 2 years post GDPR, we see that the substantive provisions that are in place in these data protection and privacy frameworks are quite robust. The Achilles heel is enforcement. And that comes in part, I think, by these very differing attitudes to regulation that we see across Europe and likely globally, because I think this would kind of map to different regulatory attitudes across the world. And so the European Commission kind of puts this very diplomatically. It says, we're still trying to develop a culture of data protection across the European Union. But I think reading between the lines, you might say that there's some disagreement between regulators as to whether or not enforcement is sufficient. So I think that's maybe another point to keep in mind here, that we have the legal framework, but there's this big query about whether or not it's being effectively enforced. And then finally, maybe just to pick up on Julia's point about, and John's as well, about the interaction here between sovereign states and in this instance, Google and Apple. I mean, I do think this, again, you know, as will be obvious from the Australian example, which everyone was keeping an eye on, control over infrastructure obviously gives commercial power, but it also has the power by, for instance, negatively impacting media plurality to impact upon our fundamental rights and freedoms downstream. And I think on the plus side, what we can see is that over the past few years, in particular in the European Union, where you've seen a lot of regulatory experimentation, but also, as Julia said, in Australia through the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, we've seen kind of steps towards trying to more accurately harness or capture the economic power that is being exercised by tech companies. And here I would say, for instance, if you look at the European Union, there's now a recognition that we can't consider a company like Google as operating in very discrete siloed markets, that in fact its power in one market is allowing it to capture and to leverage power in adjacent markets, and that we need to look at kind of the architecture as a whole and the infrastructure as a whole to see the various places where its power resides, and to look at that as a kind of an aggregate unit rather than in kind of discrete economic units as has been the case up until now. So there are some advancements, but I do think it's interesting that no sovereign state challenged Google and Apple on on the constraints that it was imposing on the way in which their own apps were designed in this context. So there were some grumblings from France, but no attempt to formally regulate. And I'm just wondering whether now that the plan is to kind of have contact tracing inbuilt as an update to the operating system, whether that will raise other queries. So I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Well, that was certainly fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I have a whole lot of questions that I would like to throw in. There's lots of people on the Q&A who throw in questions they want to come in. Everyone who's just been speaking, you're all very welcome to stay up on the channel, by the way. I think the intention is for everyone to be able to respond all at once to the questions. So please do pop back in. I'm going to shamelessly use my moderator privilege to ask the first question, which is that we've had this conversation around the large tech companies making gigantic public policy decisions, apparently with a minimum of pushback from governments and from wider populations. At the same time, there was a conversation in Julia's, a section of Julia's presentation was in relation to the effect of Facebook on news. So on one hand, we have a situation where people are trusting governments less, maybe trusting tech more, and also the scope of government action is being corroded by the power that technology companies have. It struck me that one of the reasons why people trust governments less at the moment, there's lots of reasons, but one of them is technology. It's the fact it's the information and how it's now disseminated over Facebook and similar platforms. So we have this kind of dual prong attack on the public space that have been traditionally elaborated. So my simple question from that winding set of words is, would you identify big tech, as it currently stands, as a threat to technology, as a threat to democracy?
Could I have a go at that? The answer to that, James, is very simple. Yes. It's as simple as that. I mean, David Runciman and I did a research project a couple of years ago on the implications of this technology for democracy, and the headline story that came out of it was the story is not good. And one of the outcomes of that was David's big book, How Democracy Ends. So that's the first bit of it. I mean, the question about it's clear that liberal democracies are in trouble for various reasons, of which technology is one, but it's not the only one. My hunch is that in relation to, say, the election of Donald Trump and other shocks, that the technology played a necessary, or is a necessary but not sufficient explanation for it, because all kinds of other stuff was going on as well. But I think it goes back to things that were said this morning, which is that one of the inescapable conclusions we need to reach is that the technology is now political. All technological decisions have political implications and sometimes are driven by political considerations. And the second thing is that I would say we need to switch the question round, because up to now we've been thinking, what are the implications of these technologies and the companies which drive them for democracy? I think in the end we're going to have to confront the question: what are the requirements of a democracy from technology companies? You know, we switch it the other way around, because they exist courtesy of the laws and conventions, the protection of intellectual property, and the vast amount of publicly funded research on which they feed. And yet, up to now, they've had, as it were, a free ride on that. And sooner or later, we need some kind of change of perspective on this stuff. And I thought that the COVID shock might prompt that. But the kinds of questions that Orla has raised and Heleen has raised and Julia has raised suggest that we're really only at the beginning of that questioning.
Can I ask a question then of all four of you? Because I'm believing that, but I'm just trying to get to a bit of the source of this. Can we just, is it a design, a deliberate attempt of subjugating democracy or whatever, or is it the market's just being foul and unregulated, we're just not doing it right? Or is it that we just have a generation of politicians who just do not understand tech enough to even start those conversations? I mean, are we dealing with ignorance? Are we dealing with deliberation and debate? What is the monster here?
I'll have a quick go at that, and then I'll stop talking. I think you're operating at the wrong level, Irene. I mean, for example, in my opinion, one of the most toxic companies in the world is Facebook. But you can't explain that in relation to, as it were, the personalities of the people who run Facebook. I am pretty sure they're not monsters, broadly speaking, with some exceptions, and so on. But they're simply running a public company with a set of legal conventions that we operate, which is that the sole function of the company is to maximize shareholder value. And in those circumstances, they do what they do, just as my lovely cats kill birds. It's the point. So we're dealing with a kind of a form of capitalism which does what it's doing, and we need to address it at that level.
Exactly, but over the last 50 years, 100 years, or as many years as capitalism have existed, governments have had instruments, ways. I mean, you go back to the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, all of that. Governments have had instruments to deal with it, to understand it a bit better. Economists have bashed at it, tried it, handcuffed them, did all of that. Why are they not doing so now? Turn off the mute.
I can have a go, but I'm sure Julian has more to say on this. For me, I can't quite go to the causes, but looking at, you know, why the legal response, for instance, has fallen short, I think it's because the legal framework has been typically very reluctant to deal with issues of kind of private power, because we're looking at this, as John has said, from a very capitalist economic perspective, where a lot of the US kind of orthodoxy around kind of letting markets run their course, having kind of minimum interference, the Chicago kind of school has, I think, been promoted around the world and been accepted. And so I think even in regions where you are now starting to see a bit of pushback against that, you would need to see, in some ways, a kind of a full frontal attack on the business model itself. And even for the European Union, where you have, on the one hand, what looks to be a fairly robust Charter of Fundamental Rights, increased emphasis on the social, at its roots, it remains an economic entity. And so there's a reluctance to tackle the business model full on. I think a great illustration of this is that the e-privacy framework, which was supposed to kind of complement the GDPR in the area of electronic communications, and where one of the key proposals was that you would do something quite drastic to tackle kind of personalized advertising, because that was kind of the impetus behind a lot of the kind of data-driven exploitation that we're seeing at the moment. That kind of came aground completely in the political negotiations because of the economic implications that it would have, and also because of a lot of lobby and capture in kind of subtle and not so subtle ways. And so I think what you would need here is really, you know, that kind of very stark confrontation. And we haven't seen any legal framework do that yet.
Yeah.
Just add to a little bit. Just to add to that, I do agree with you, but with a little bit of a twist. And I do understand the criticism against the neoclassical economics that the Chicago school that we've had to inherit. But yet, and time again, historically, the Chicago school, the case was made when antitrust had to come in, when DOJ had to come in, when it was obvious. Is this therefore the case that economics have failed to make the case that this is an antitrust issue? Because what we are trying to make the case here is the link then therefore between democracy and antitrust, and saying that this is not good for markets. And you're arguing actually it's really good for markets, but to the detriment of society. And I would probably argue the other way. I would say, no, actually this is not good for markets. But someone hasn't yet made the case enough for the DOJ or any of the antitrust within the government to say this is a problem. And this is one of the reasons I would just posit that the government can't act if the DOJ or any antitrust authorities can't be able to make the case. They would just wax lyrical, but also some other things and make it political. The fact that it's being made political is because the economics are failing to make that case. Would you say that?
I'm not an economist, and I'm kind of keeping abreast of what's happening in this community without being an antitrust scholar myself. So I don't want to, you know, label the economists as failing. What I would say is that there's been huge.
I'm a market design economist. I'm very happy to label them as failing. It's
okay,
fine.
I'll leave that. I think in the antitrust community, there's been huge institutional resistance to factoring in of anything that is not demonstrable or quantifiable from an economic perspective into the equation. And so, you know, even if you look at something like the consumer welfare standard that's used in antitrust law, trying to move it beyond price and the impact on price for consumers to, for instance, a consideration of product quality has been met with huge resistance. And because the argument is, well, quality has many dimensions, how do you measure something that is maybe more privacy invasive but offers more personalization? You know, for one person, privacy invasion would be looked at as a reduction in quality, for another personalization and advance, etc. And I think in the EU, there's been there's a little bit more receptiveness to that, which is, I think, why the Google Fitbit merger, for instance, has now been moved to a phase 2. But yet a lot of the standards and thresholds from a legal perspective that have been put in place are very kind of precautionary and hard to meet. So the burden of proof is really for an authority to demonstrate harm rather than for, you know, merging parties to demonstrate benefit. So I think it's just unpicking, you know, the years that, you know, the Chicago years where we've seen the legal framework develop and be kind of propagated worldwide. That's proving to be difficult.
There is a controversial way of putting the question you're asking, Irene. I mean, one of the hypotheses that we came up with when we were thinking about this before was that given the way things have panned out, that no liberal democracy can actually curb the power of these companies now, because the traditions of law that we have make it such that any serious confrontation with them would take 20 years to work out, and we have no appetite for that kind of thing. Our legislators and so on have no appetite for that kind of thing. So that the hypothesis was that the only societies that can control these entities are actually authoritarian ones, and we have a good working model of that in China.
That's rather bleak. Oh dear.
You mentioned, John, earlier there was something around the way in which early on in this particular crisis there was just a presumption that an application would be used. And I wonder if there's something around just the sheer capacity of whether or not our leaders are even capable of willing to, well, two things really. Whether or not they can deal with these problems in and of themselves. So we have the comparison to the antitrust disputes and actions of the past, but you know, Standard Oil never actually owned the airwaves at the time. So there's a kind of a power differential here potentially, which makes this different. The secondly is to pick up on the points around the Chicago school. I wonder if, and this is to circle back into the point I was launching into just there, there's something around the propensity over the last, say, 30, 40 years of state actors to just privatize previously state functions, to give them away to various forms of outsourcing providers, be that, you know, even stuff like prisons, let alone educations and health. Do you think these two things combine? So the first is power, and then the second is just the ideology of the government as a contracting entity, I suppose.
I think the ideological point is a key thing in it, because one of the reasons why our democracies are in trouble is because ruling elites in them have generally been full-on supporters of a neoliberal view of the world, which is that essentially governments are not very good at lots of things, and companies are better than them, and also that markets are better ways of doing things than otherwise. And over 40 years, you've had this gradual accumulation of this set of it's an ideological convention in the sense that that it defines what in government circles are regarded as being thinkable and unthinkable. I remember a moment, for example, when one of the contractors, which had been putting tags on prisoners, was discovered to have been charging the government for years for prisoners that had died. And a government minister was interviewed about this scandal, and the interviewer said, "I see that this company is on a list of approved contractors for new contracts. I take it it'll be taken off." And the minister actually said, "No, that would be unthinkable." And at that point, you realize how deep this kind of mindset has. So it's very hard to break these mindsets, and they've been long time building. And that's a key element in this story, I think. And challenging the mindset is one of the things we need to do.
Can I offer a little provocation stimulation into this? Because as I've been hearing this about ideological convention, one of the observations I've made of us and our peers during the last 6 months is how much of a trap it is to get into debates like, well, if you were to put some privacy constraints around the Contact Tracing Act, what would they be? Or if there were to be legislative safeguards, what would they be? And I'm just wondering for any of you, are there other opportunities that we should be pursuing? I mean, Orla, that sort of portrayal of the role of the regulator as the critical friend is still eating at me. And I think it's almost punching the space to be in the places that will change, you know, to shortcut that 20-year journey, John, and to not play into the, okay, well, this isn't just, I even think it about even once you get into the human rights and privacy framing as our only playing field. But has anyone in the last little while been sort of thinking, are there other opportunities, places where we should go while everybody's circulating the contact tracing debate, or some of these other ones where we can tell the inexorable momentum is, we know what government will do, we know what the companies will do, and it's sort of, it's a set piece, really.
Can I just add something to it? Can tech solutionism be solved by tech solutionism?
It's a nice question, but it's a bit like asking whether cocaine addiction can be solved with nicotine. I think it's at the same level, and my hunch is that we need to operate at a higher level in this area. For example, and it is very, very difficult because we're all wrapped up in the bubble in which we have been conditioned. But I was thinking about this, trying to find metaphors for it, and one of them was, well, what industries do we have that are kind of properly, or at least better regulated than tech? And one answer is, although there are people who disagree with this, is the pharmacological industry, the pharmaceutical industry. And then I thought, okay, well, let's imagine what the world would be like in relation to that, to the pharmaceutical industry if we didn't regulate it. And I was thinking about this. There's some bright researcher in an AstraZeneca lab, and they come up with a really interesting, and she comes up with a really interesting molecule, which is actually looks as if it might attack one of the fundamental causes of Alzheimer's. And what happens? Well, she talks to her lab supervisor. There's then a lab seminar in which she presents her results, and her colleagues think it's bloody great, it's very interesting, and so on. And then 3 days later, AstraZeneca puts it on the market. That's what happens with the tech industry at the moment. Facebook it moves into Myanmar, a country that has no experience of democracy, has never had the internet before. It has no staff in Myanmar. And what do we have? We have, in 6 months, we have a genocide and ethnic cleansing, largely fueled by Facebook's apps. And you know, it's like somebody releasing a smallpox vaccine into an unprotected country, and we have no mechanism for thinking about it like that. That's all I'm getting. I looked back at the history and I discovered that it's only in 1906 that there was the first legislation in the US about safety of medicines. And the FDA in the United States dates, I think, from an act of 1938. So in relation to the tech industry, we are somewhere between 1906 and 1938, I think.
I'm just going to pick up on Julia's provocation. Look, it's something I've been thinking about myself, and you know, personally, I suffer from a lack of imagination. So I think if we were to kind of move beyond existing legal frameworks, or to just kind of shake off that framing, I'm probably not the person to do it. But I also do think this poses a bit of a policy dilemma, because to come up with something from scratch, it means that we're going to be talking about longer timeframes. And so part of me thinks that rather than kind of rethinking the legal landscape completely, we need to think about reforming and making the best use of the legal tools that we already have available to us. You know, so I'd be the first to say that I think that the GDPR has a lot of flaws from a legislative perspective. At the same time, I think it has a lot of untapped potential. And so I think in the short term, the best thing to do would be to kind of try to facilitate its enforcement in an effective way, you know, while recognizing that that hasn't happened at all to date. And similarly, you know, with competition law, for instance, I think that a lot of the tools that you have there are quite malleable. So it is really about getting people to kind of step away from the traditional interpretation of those tools and to think about them a little bit more creatively. And again, you know, I think that the European Union, with the new proposed competition tool and the Digital Services Act, is at least trying to do that, but it's facing incredible resistance. You know, I also think maybe kind of beyond or adjacent to the legal framework, I would be personally interested in seeing a lot more around support, financial support, and other, you know, the mapping, a lot more transparency about who is funding what, because I think that is very much driving competition debates, and that there's been some kind of high profile discussion of that in competition law circles, that pretty much, well, it's an exaggeration to say all of the research is funded by industry, but a lot of the research is funded by industry, and that's not necessarily subject to full disclosures. And I think the same thing is going to happen in data protection and privacy, or if it's not already happening. So I think there are kind of other things that we can do in order to facilitate the effective enforcement of existing laws. But, you know, yeah, I like the idea of jettisoning everything and thinking about this afresh, but I just worry then that we lose a lot of time and that incremental advances might be more effective in the long run.
Just as a question, I mean, as a point to make about time, I mean, what was that? Is that Douglas, Hitchhiker's Guide? What's his name? Douglas Adams. I mean, what did he say? Bad news travel at the speed of light or something. So I always think about that when they talk about misinformation and fake news, because my God, can those things travel? My mother from half the world away can send me a meme that just barely just got out of probably Russia. You know, I mean, that she seriously must be validating Douglas Adams right now, you know. And mindful of that, the tech world, when Facebook scaled up, don't forget, they dethroned Friends List, which was at 150 million people. So the scalability of the tech industry really can't be underestimated in the way upstart little innovation that could come up from anywhere in the world could actually dethrone. Now, I'm probably saying this more optimistically than I really feel. But surely we can't then use one set of measurements to say that, oh, it's going to be slow, and yet impose that on an industry that flies at the speed of light.
And also, if I may interject on that, impose it where? Impose it upon what portion? Because when we say this industry, we're not talking necessarily about any one thing. We're talking about an entire market dynamic, that is surveillance capitalism. You're talking about the taxation structures, which are embedded in multiple different states around the world, all of which have competing aims. You're talking about controls on how they disseminate information, the effect that has on liberal democracies in particular, but also elsewhere. You're talking about how new products are got in and how they disrupt, you know, other industries. It's a multi-layered issue, each of which any democratic state, should it somehow magically decide to tackle it, you know, it'd have to be facing all of these issues all at once. And by the way, the people who you're fighting, well, was it Apple or was it Google that was found out to be worth more than the entire FTSE 100 last week? I mean, you know, these problems are intractable. There's every reason to be pessimistic.
Fueled by outrage, right? I mean, there's a lot of fuel. It's fueled by outrage. Little companies, big companies, policy. I mean, if you look at the history of all technology, fueled by different things, opportunity, outrage, something, you know.
But look where you're locating the opportunity, though, Irene, because we mentioned China as being the only worthy example of where this has been fought back. China probably wouldn't have been able to do that quite so effectively had it opened up in the 90s, because they would have multiple different people getting airtime and conflicting interest groups. So now we're having to route, a private solution to a public problem, because I think at core, if I may put words in your mouth, and correct me if you disagree, as a whole, we don't trust that democratic societies will be able to mobilize and get their states to act on the timeframes needed. I was open for disagreement, by the way. There's a tendentious comment. We can a shocked silence all around.
Yeah, maybe I might jump in from here. When we discuss trust, it always, if you look at governments, they make a lot of mistakes. It has already been said, and rightly so. But it strikes me that people are so critical, and also rightly so, on what governments can do, especially their law enforcement services and national security services. But at least, let's say, in a seriously working democracy, there is oversight on these. But we don't have these mechanisms for private parties, and I find that really worrisome. Not that oversight is the only solution. There's no silver bullet here, but that is, really one thing pretty much overlooked. Also when we discuss these kind of things in government as well, people tend to overlook these. And then I think what hasn't, maybe more implicitly been discussed is the effect of networks, the networking effect. That is one of the ultimate nuts to crack, I think, in these discussions. And I think there we need a whole load of, regulatory policy measures, if these can be developed at all. And it has been said already, this will take some time, because all the law, all the policy measures we have, they are so interwoven. If you turn one button, then you turn 99 buttons at the same time, at least, in legislation and policy measures. So, this is sort of complexly from the ground, but this is where you have to start as well. And I think it would be useful for policymakers if they could get some practical advice from this, from science, because what I see is that many people in policy making, they are operating on like you do with stocks on day trade. So they're day trading, but the government has been made mean and lean, which means that there is hardly any time for strategy development, and that is also worrying me on these issues. For instance, take the Digital Services Act. We are internally discussing it now. And people are really going in the stream. Well, maybe we have to. We really have to work on transparency. Companies must become transparent. I think transparency is really not the solution. It's part of the problem, actually. Here, if you launch it like that, where we should start from is looking at, what do you regulate? You regulate people's behavior, and that hasn't changed over time, I think. And that's also where we have to start. So these are very common issues from the ground perspective, so to say. So I was wondering whether that could make a move forward in the thinking. So go back to what regulation is supposed to regulate, and that is human behavior, be it Zuckerberg or a small, medium-sized enterprise or a government, a minister. So minister is also a person. So I'd like to hear just maybe some reflection on that.
One of the points, maybe, I'd like to just circle back to Orla. I wasn't at all. I do want us, if we are there and think of their possibilities. I think it's though finding, for example, and John, your example of the somebody who comes up with an idea and then launches it on the public in 3 days. The fact that we've got now a global evidence of apps promoted by governments to actually control the motion of people in the most instrumental way that has led to the human exchange. That happened without any evidence, without any efficacy tests, without any kind of ongoing trials and so on, I think suggests to me that us looking at the detail of whether the checks and balances within, or whether the privacy rules or the particular model, whether it was this one or that one, that doesn't feel like it's so much the issue. The issue is, how did we get to launch this stuff on the public without any checks? And how do we stop that happening next time? And why is it so different just because it's digital? And that's the sort of, but there's this challenge, because I feel like the plays get set so often, and they come to that. I love the idea that, in all of the jurisdictions that are built out of fundamental rights, that there's scope for thinking through all of the affordances and the flexibilities that you described, Orla. And it's just this kind of constant nagging impulse of where do we raise them when, say, it's the human rights around just your freedom of movement, and does that enable more possibilities for constraining technology or putting regulation in place that would make sense than just through the sort of Article 8 kind of considerations? That was the sort of prompt, and using the full flexibility of a human rights framework. And yeah, just the sort of taking on from the solutionism comes from the exceptionalism of this particular set of technologies. And maybe the opportunity of the sustained lockdown is one for that longer project of punching open different spaces to know where we usually get in debate and where it pans out and where we could build instead.
To follow up on that, I mean, I think that the pandemic has already been very interesting and in a strange, bit macabre way useful, because it has illuminated a great deal of things that we should have known, and perhaps some of us did know but didn't properly articulate or whatever. And there's a sense in which the way in which the contact tracing app discussion has revealed issues that might have been circulating among specialists, but in general were not much discussed elsewhere. That might also turn out to have been positive, because it has led us to interrogate things that we should have been interrogating before. The one thing that I don't know, I'd love to find out, is has there been much critical interrogation of Apple and Google about their APIs for the contact tracing? Because I don't know of it, if it exists. Or did they just get away with it by saying, we're going to do this, end of story?
And I think very early co-option of the tech industry too. So broader supporters, and the tech adjacent, like EFF and others, were consulted very early. In fact, pushed for them to move in this space, as did government. So there was a kind of very early assessment, and then not a lot. Sorry, James.
I was just saying that based on the because we've been conducting a landscape of the contact tracing applications in the HAT Lab as part of the Innovate UK grant that we got. To the best of our knowledge, there hasn't been much of a pushback or response, except for in certain government circles, and only to a limited extent against the Google Apple API.
Yeah, that's my next session, the economic session, where I'm trying at least to make the case for market manipulation, and the way we could formulate what antitrust regulation might really look at, because from an economics perspective, you can make a case for what we call the source. So I know many don't think as me, but if you think about the asset of a personal data, when they release that news, so I found my world shook a bit. My economics world shook a bit, simply because we kind of know what the personal data that is out there, what's been mined, what's been used, ed tech, all of that, and you kind of know the mess that it's in. But when the news came that there was this new API, it was literally someone's found a new oil well. It was like someone's found a new source in the desert somewhere, and basically what has happened is immediately when the source is found, the entire supply chain has to be controlled, and like who gets to mine it, who gets to use it, and all that. And as it progressed, we watched it very closely from an economics front to start to see, and that can, whether or not the case can be built for market manipulation because of the control of the source. And in most cases that we do for personal data economics, we always look at source, because the moment you control a source, you become a monopoly. So identity is a very weird thing. No one controls it, and so you can then argue there's no monopoly because you could sort of get my identity from many places, right? You're not compelled to log in. But once there is a lock-in on the source that indisputably becomes verifiable, and the thing, you can almost make the case for monopolistic intentions. So in a weird kind of way, trying to develop a different kind of framework of which we see the tech industry through the lens of markets and market manipulation, and it's kind of where I'm trying to drive some of this agenda, because the way we've built it on the hat is really trying to create regulated assets, right? So the moment you become a regulated asset, it just naturally, like any regulated asset, has a certain set of behavior. We have 100 years of dealing with regulated asset, from God knows enriched plutonium to gold, you know. And but the need to do to turn the economics around for us is really about the way the asset is moving and the mobility of the asset. And if it moves at that kind of speed, you know the market's out of control. Then the question is, how then do you try to, you know, be able to corral that in all within the frameworks of the market? I get that it's a completely different thing that most people would look at, but at least on the economics front, certainly that's how we look at it. And that's why the Apple Google API was of tremendous concern to our group.
I've just got an eye on the clock as we're due to end in 3 or 4 minutes. It struck me, you know, as we've been having our fascinating discussion, we have had a range of audience questions come in, most of which I think have been answered in the course of the discussion. But I think there's the top ranked one from Peter Zip, I think could be quite interesting to hear from each of you. So this is, how can governments rein in the tech giants when their own credibility is crumbling? So for the purpose of this, I'd like to ask each of you if there was one initiative that you would like to see a government, we could say presume the British government perhaps, or if not that, just governments in general, carrying out today to substantively change this, you know, power dynamic. What would it be? So just one initiative from each of you. The most important.
Well, I'll start.
John?
I think outlawing the current business model of social media would be a key start. I know there was the surveillance capitalism side of social media. All these companies are different and there's no magic bullet, but there is one particularly toxic business model, and I think that could be addressed and should be.
An argument for what they could do to start to cripple it, which would be, I'd take use the criminal law. There's potent evidence that if you want to take on Facebook, they're funneling the proceeds of crime from criminal cartels, funneling misinformation and so on, and a hardcore criminal action that required proper processes around knowing your customer at the front end of receiving advertising, and the entire business base, I think would require some friction in processes that currently are frictionless, and would start to disable the model. So I'd go criminal action, but I also am going to give a plug for the taking some of the issues that people feel like are untouchable, like the the news versus news media versus the platforms like the Aussies are doing.
Thank you. Orla?
Well, you know, I agree that addressing the business model would be a very fruitful starting point. I suppose, though, for me, part of the issue at present is trying to kind of address this through very discrete policies, whereas I think one challenge that governments and lawmakers are facing at the moment is just not seeing the whole picture, not seeing, as Heleen said, how, you know, legislation in one area can have a knock-on effect in another. And, you know, just a very basic example, there's a lot of empirical evidence emerging that the GDPR has actually reinforced the position of the dominant digital players because they're shoring up the data themselves and not sharing it with third parties. So actually, I think rather than kind of individual pieces of policy, we need the ability of somebody to be able to look at this more holistically, and that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. I fully support them, and I wrote them down to bring them in the government at some point. Well, I would really like to start a discussion from what do we want to regulate? As I said, it's people behavior, and we have fundamental rights, but we have also obligations as citizens, but also as all other actors in society. And that includes that people do have responsibilities and accountability for what they are doing, particularly the larger players in our societies. So I really hope that at some point we can enforce these accountabilities and responsibilities and formulate things so that companies cannot work around them. That would be really one of the very tiny mechanisms we might start to work on. Yeah, thanks.
So I am going to be completely left field. Sorry, I'm going to be, hello. Sorry, I'm going to be completely left field about this. I know I'm in a humanities session, but this is sort of leading into next one. My approach on how I'd like the government to really think about it is tax. Very pure and simple. The GDP is measuring only a portion of the economy today. GAF economy has absorbed most of the GDP into the black hole of the internet. Your tax revenues are going down. You're trying to think of tax. Keep thinking. Because the only way you're going to get this back, this tax revenues back, is to start bringing the economy out of the GAF economy. There are different ways of doing it, but it's one of the ways I'd like the government to think about.
I think that's a strong idea. No representation without taxation.
Yes, unfortunately, John, it is unfortunately chain addiction probably to a nicotine addiction.
Sure, but
it's
even
not the
so,
best solution.
Even so.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for that. That was a fascinating talk. Professor Norton, is there anything you'd like to say to conclude?
No, I'd really like to thank my three fellow panelists. I would really like to have us all in one room, but it's been great. Thank you for doing it, and thank you, James, for chairing it. Okay.
Thank you for chairing. That was really moderating. That's been an excellent session. I really enjoyed that. We'll be having the next talk the next session chaired by Irene very shortly at 3:45. So do please join to carry on the discussion. Thank you very much.